So Ms Butler has provided standard ventilation provisions used by KiwiRail and plan changes around New Zealand as an appendix to her summary evidence for your reference. And this is being provided in the absence of the applicant or Mr Stiles proposing specific ventilation provisions. KiwiRail considers that the provisions provided by Ms Butler are appropriate to be incorporated into the precinct provisions and would adequately address KiwiRail's concerns as to ventilation.
Thank you.
So moving on to vibration, KiwiRail acknowledges that the vibration provisions that support in its submission on Plan Change 150 have not been supported by Mr Stiles or Mr Ibbotson. So as will be addressed by Ms Butler, KiwiRail maintains that from its experience across the rail network, vibration effects from high frequency freight corridors like the Marsden Point line are significant and should be managed. However, we also acknowledge that KiwiRail has not provided separate expert evidence in respect of these effects for Plan Change 150, and that vibration controls are less established in New Zealand district plans than those for noise. So with this context in mind, KiwiRail accepts it would be appropriate for the vibration controls to be left to the district-wide appeals, where expert evidence has been provided in respect of vibration in regards to those appeals. This is also considered appropriate given Plan Change 150 applies a non-complying activity status to sensitive activities within 70 metres of the rail corridor, which from KiwiRail's experience is the key section subject to vibration effects. And this non-complying status will limit the ability of sensitive activities within that area that will be subject to vibration effects. As the applicant has not included any other vibration provisions within the precinct, this means that any district-wide vibration provisions which come through as a result of the urban and services plan changes, if they're accepted, would apply to the Plan Change 150 land through the district-wide rules. Excellent. So moving on to the point on building setbacks, if you had no further questions on noise and vibration.
Oh, sorry, did you have any, Commissioner Demery, at that stage?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, section 4, thanks.
Yes, so at section 4, KiwiRail's submission also sought the inclusion of a 3-metre setback from the Marsden Point line designation boundary. And so, as has been already explained, the nature of the rail corridor activities means that there is potential for significant health, safety and amenity issues if the interface between this corridor and surrounding buildings and activities is not appropriately managed. So setbacks are a separate issue from noise and vibration, and they're about ensuring sufficient space for everyday activities to occur safely on neighbouring properties. Activities like vegetation clearance, painting, cleaning of buildings to occur within those setbacks rather than encroaching into the railway corridor and therefore interrupting rail operations. So the Section 42A report has recommended a 2.5 metre setback be provided within the planning maps along the railway corridor boundary with the Plan Change 150 zones. So while this reflects a reduction in the setback sought by KiwiRail in its original submission on Plan Change 150, it does align with the setback mapping that has been applied to existing business zones within the district, as has been confirmed in KiwiRail's district-wide appeals on setbacks, which have already been resolved. So KiwiRail therefore supports the setback as provided for by the Section 42A report.
Great, thank you.
Great.
Commissioner Demery, anything from you?
It's probably a question for Ms Butler, but just to refresh my memory, whether the amended provisions proposed in Mr Badham's evidence included the setback or not.
Yeah, we need to check. Sorry, I've realised I cut you off before your conclusion.
Okay.
Oh, that's completely fine. And I can pass that question over to Ms Butler, but my understanding is that those setback provisions haven't been picked up. But Ms Butler might want to confirm from her reading.
I've not been able to find anything about it in my reading of the documents, so I just want to make sure that it's not missed as we go forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did the commissioners have any further questions?
I don't have any for you. No, thank you. Commissioner Dimmery?
No, thank you very much.
No, that's right. We're now in your hands, Ms. Butler. I think we've had something else come through from you this morning as well, haven't we? We've got a summary. Yes, great, got it.
Yeah.
Have you got that to hand, Commissioner Dimmery? Okay.
Just one moment to open the legal submissions.
I'll concentrate on
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Dimmery. I'll skip the introduction. However, I'll concentrate on the summary statement, given that things have moved on to a degree since the lodgement of evidence, and there's obviously much to support in some of the changes that have occurred. I suppose I should, the key points starting at paragraph 3 in terms of protecting the Marsden Point line is that this was a project that that has significant regional and national importance. The Marsden Point line is obviously tied up with the future of the ports of Auckland, and we're anticipating that that will reach capacity sometime in the 2030s. And certainly we are actively and have funding to actively purchase the land required to construct the line. And we also have business case approval in principle to develop the design and move forward on implementation of the line. So at this stage, we're actively looking at a design for the corridor, and that corridor will be likely to be formed for twin tracks, but one track would be put in the centre and to be put in that formation initially. So you can anticipate that works would start within 4 to 6 years for the line, and so that is more perhaps more present or likely than perhaps indicated in the proceedings to date. The Marsden Point line will provide significant national and regional benefits to the efficient operation of Northport and provide low carbon freight connections into the Auckland market. These benefits need to be protected from limits on operating hours or capacity caused by reverse sensitivity of new noise sensitive developments. And that includes not just the complaints, but also from the effects, potential effects that lead to those complaints, which are the noise effects emanating from the corridor. While KiwiRail is providing insulation to existing dwellings adjacent to the line, as we've previously noted, it can't internalise all effects or be expected to provide insulation to every new residential development neighbouring the line. Instead, it is entirely appropriate for the district plan to protect this nationally significant infrastructure from the reverse sensitivity effects. And we look to councils up and down the country really to acknowledge and safeguard the existing transport corridors that we have.
Could I ask a question about
Sure.
the designation at the moment, as we're sort of on those sort of high level issues? The designation, so the designation goes into the site, or into, it doesn't go into the plan change area, but you know it cuts down onto land that was previously part of the lot along the boundary. But it's got that it sort of curves down nicely at the east and then stops very abruptly on the west, which I presume. Do you know what the intention was for taking that piece of land?
So you're talking about the fact that the corridor comes sort of
it's got a very sharp
yes.
edge on one end, which you'd expect if the line was to go through that area, you'd expect a curve or
the
something
corridor's
abrupt change.
Certainly. The corridor is quite wide towards the eastern side. I think it's about a 45 to 50 metre wide length of corridor. Typically, KiwiRail can operate 2 lines within about a 20-metre wide corridor. However, I do note that the original intention in the land plans was that that corridor would be 50 metres entirely through there. But somehow during the hearings process, or the process during the designation process, that kink has developed in that area. And I can only suppose that that may have been in terms of negotiations with adjacent landowners, or for some other reason that was accommodated. However, there's still sufficient room within there to operate the line, twin lines.
So is it reasonable? Because I think we heard from Mr. Robertson yesterday, who said he expected fast rail movement to be in the northern part of that designation, if that makes sense. So not coming down into that kink, I guess, as you've called it. Is that a reasonable assumption, or are we not in a position to make any assumptions at the moment?
It was a point I was going to bring up later, in the sense of I noticed that Mr. Ibbotson was using a sort of a central median line to take a measurement from. At the moment, we're designing the track. Once we complete the design and the initial formation, it will be for 2 tracks, so potentially side by side. So it won't necessarily be in the centre of a single line in the centre of the corridor. I noticed that the 70-metre distance for the non-complying status is taken from the boundary of the railway designation, and we do tend to take and ask for our noise buffer area to be taken from the external boundary. That's because we're not exactly sure where the railway line will be within that designated area. In answer to your question about the larger area, so 50 metres is a reasonably good size where you could potentially put a turnback or a siding. So you could even potentially add a 3rd track in that area. So I'm not aware of any proposal that be done, but there is the potential within the designation at that width to use that land.
And I think some mention was made. I think Mr. Riley made a comment in his evidence regarding a potential passenger station. I presume that's not on the cards now, but so again, it may happen one day, but no talk about it at the moment.
There's certainly no project at large about passenger services on this line.
Sorry, that was it for me, just for those sort of higher level issues that related more to the designation. Did you have any questions about any of those issues, Commissioner Dimmery?
No, thank you. That was good. I did wonder after yesterday whether that kink might have been for a rail siding or something when it was previously industrially zoned. So I guess we'll never know.
Perfect for a station.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, carry on.
So returning to paragraph 6 of my summary, we're very, in terms of early discussions with us, the applicant recognised the need to manage the effects of the NPL on the change zoning status of the plan change area, and applied the commercial zoning along the boundary with the railway corridor. Applied a non-complying activity status to noise sensitivities within 70 metres, and provided through noise zone 2A to require acoustic insulation to now noise sensitive activities, not just residential activities within that zone. Kiwi Rail strongly supports those elements of the application. I think you've heard previously. And they're critical to ensuring the interface between residential use and what will shortly be a significant freight line is appropriately managed. And for the reasons set out in the legal submissions, I don't consider it appropriate for these or any other provisions managing noise to be left to the urban and services plan changes, as appears to be suggested in the applicant's legal submissions at 5C. we rely on and agree that both noise experts support the need for rail noise to be managed in the precinct, and to remove those provisions would be to leave a significant gap in the planning framework. I acknowledge the comments in the rebuttal evidence that Kiwi Rail hasn't presented separate acoustic evidence in respect of Plan Change 150. However, we have had significant experience in managing the rail network and ensuring that appropriate planning provisions for development of neighbouring land around New Zealand is taken into account. I've had 15 years experience in these matters, and I think I'm appropriately qualified to put forward the amendments that I consider required to suitably protect the MPL from the potential effects of development without inappropriately constraining development from proceeding as the applicant intends. With this experience in mind, in reference to some of Mr. Stiles' conclusions, Kiwi Rail continues to support the precinct's noise provisions being strengthened. Specifically, and this is probably a significant change from my originally lodged evidence, I didn't previously consider that the amendment to MCP Policy 9 proposed by Mr. Stiles achieved the same requirement to provide certainty about the restrictions applying to the 70-metre setback for noise-sensitive activities. However, in Mr. Badham's rebuttal evidence, changes to the policy framework at MCP 06 and MCP P9 have actually strengthened the policy framework through the use of the term avoid and through greater clarity being provided in Policy 9. And I now consider this better supports the administration of the non-complying rule in that area and consequently support those changes. The critical thing, I think, for Kiwi Rail is that going forward, and for planners administering the plan controls, is to have that policy framework strengthened enough to understand that there is a reason for that control, and to be able to ensure that is managed reasonably conservatively, so that those effects those adverse effects don't occur. So I'm much happier about the policy framework now. I do support Mr. Stiles' analysis at section 5 of his initial memo that the northern part of sub-precinct D, which Mr. Ibbotson talked about yesterday, may suffer sleep disturbance from nighttime freight train movements and requires acoustic insulation. I mean, we project that the MPL will have 24-hour operations within 5 years of opening, and these operations will be freight trains. So I agree that noise zone 2A should be extended to capture all the residents identified by Mr. Stiles, which might be affected by train movements. It's somewhat tied up too by the difference in the measurement between Mr. Ibbotson, where he talked about the practical effect of zone 2A's 100 metres coming from the centre line of the railway corridor compared to the boundary. And I think extending it down to the nearest street, which I think is Casey Road, would be appropriate, and we'd support that. As noted in the legal submissions, Kiwi Rail and I support the improved ventilation requirements. As Mr. Stiles references, compliance with the building code doesn't necessarily ventilate for amenity, and failing to do so undermines acoustic insulation as occupants end up opening windows and doors in the warmer months, of which Northland obviously has more of, perhaps, than others. The applicant hasn't addressed this recommendation or incorporated ventilation requirements into the acoustic insulation requirements for its noise zones, in reliance of these being addressed in the district-wide appeals. And for the previous reasons, Kiwi Rail and myself consider that the ventilation requirements should be incorporated in the overall noise controls that would apply to the precinct. In terms of vibration, at paragraph 10, I acknowledge the comments in the applicant's rebuttal evidence that Kiwi Rail hasn't prevented further evidence in respect of vibration, and that neither the applicant nor the council supports bespoke vibration provisions. In this particular circumstance, we know when we're doing the design for the Marsden Point line that we're dealing with peat, and we're dealing with fairly mucky Onarahi chaos soils. They're not the greatest. So we have experience with vibration effects extending from these particular soils. And we also consider that they remain critical to managing any sensitive activities established in the precinct. But I do acknowledge that this issue can be addressed through the urban and services plan changes. And the management of vibration effects is complex, and our knowledge about appropriate management measures is continuing to evolve. And so I accept that and consider it appropriate that this issue can be addressed by the Environment Court on a district-wide basis. This contrasts to the reverse sensitivity effects relating to rail noise, which are both accepted in the technical evidence that has been presented, but well understood across New Zealand, and can and should now be dealt with under Plan Change 150. I also support the 2.5 metre railway line protection area as proposed by the reporting planner in the Section 42A report that applies that aligns with the district-wide mapping, which applies to the existing business zones as a result of the Kiwirau appeals on the urban and services plan changes. This provides an appropriate separation between structures in the railway corridor necessary for safe access to and the maintenance of buildings without encroaching on the railway corridor itself. And this is particularly necessary for predicted high traffic corridors like the MPL, so that property owners can maintain their buildings without disrupting frequent rail movements. And as we've noticed previously, it doesn't appear that this protection area has been incorporated into the updated precinct provisions by the applicant. So that would be good to clarify that and make sure that's picked up and carried forward. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Dimmery.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. So I'm not sure if you were listening in on the hearing yesterday when when Mr. Ibbotson was giving evidence. I take it you were from your comments, and one of the things we explored was that noise area 2A zone. So I understand from your comments you're suggesting that you consider it should extend down to Casey Road, so it would take in that entire block of sub-precinct D north of Casey Road. So what we were speaking with Mr. Ibbotson yesterday about was that I think it was described as a slice or a sliver of general residential within that 2A noise zone. And we were discussing the appropriateness of whether that should in fact be a residential zone given outdoor amenity issues. But now you're suggesting that you think that that should come all the way down, but that's just for noise insulation, but that doesn't deal with residential outdoor use. But you're saying that the effects are not so significant that we need worry with that, because I did note in Kiwirau's submission there was a request for a noise bund along that entire rail corridor, and now that's no longer proposed. I'm just trying to understand the appropriateness of that residential zone and what the effects will be, other than just health, but just pleasantness and ability to use outdoor areas, and what's a sort of reasonably conventional density area where you can expect people want to use their outdoor areas quite a lot, and notwithstanding having ventilation, they might want to have their ranch sliders open, indoor outdoor flow and all those kind of things. Sorry, that's a very long-winded way of saying there was a question yesterday about the appropriateness of the zoning general residential within the existing noise 2A, and now you're saying you want to come it down further. So I take it you're satisfied with the residential zoning. Is that correct?
So
sorry, there was quite a lot of
in our view, so Kiwirau generally asks for 100 metre from the railway corridor boundary noise effects area. So we acknowledge that within that area, houses or noise sensitive activity should be appropriately insulated against railway noise. It's not it's not it's a pragmatic control. It's not a control necessarily that guarantees everybody has a quiet environment, but it provides a reasonable chance of most people getting a good night's sleep, in addition to, but also having ventilation added to that so they can close windows to do it. I suppose my initial concern was the measurement taken for the 100 metres from the centre line of the railway corridor, in that it put that noise to, the measurement should be a little bit further extended for that 100 metre effects area, which is what we try and achieve from the railway corridor boundary rather than the centre line of the railway corridor. So there's that. The second issue is that KiwiRail doesn't generally address or require insulation around in terms of outdoor rail noise, given so it's not something that we generally seek. I know that in Waka Kotahi, it's in their noise standard, so that requires you to think about things like putting in bunds and barriers and building design to directly interrupt to bypass or block the noise source.
Can I ask a supplementary question? In terms of where you're suggesting the zone, noise zone 2A should extend to, what distance is that from the edge of the designation, southern edge of the designation?
So I understand the total depth between the edge of the KiwiRail designation and down to the nearest existing road is about 250 metres.
Yeah,
that's my GIS.
Yeah.
So what we would generally, the KiwiRail standard is generally to say within 100 metres of that, you would be looking at providing acoustic insulation.
Yeah,
we've got our 70 metre within that commercial zone, so we've got and the exclusion of noise sensitive activities, and then we've got a portion of residential within that area. I think that I was relying on John Stiles's view that if you don't have buildings blocking that particular area, what you should have is look at how you insulate noise sensitive development in that area south of the commercial area, or potentially provide a bund along the boundary that's adjacent with the railway corridor.
Yeah, I think that might be where my question came from. But Mr.
Yeah.
Stiles was recommending the bund, and I think you agreed with it, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes, the bund that KiwiRail sought was the bund across the low residential zone to the east of the plan change area, which was proposed to be added by in the John Stiles memo and agreed by the Section 42A report, but is now redundant given that that is no longer that's changed to a commercial zone.
How do you feel? You would have heard yesterday that that area you're talking about could potentially have a public open space in it. Do you have any views regarding that?
The overlap area or the area between?
I think it could be any of that residential land,
actually.
Anything south of the commercial from there to that road was an area identified for potential public open space.
I would support that.
What would be your reasons for supporting that?
I suppose it provides the physical separation. It doesn't do much for actual noise attenuation. So I'm not a noise expert, so I would expect that noise would still carry over an open space. It would depend on what you did with that particular open space area and how it was formed, what was put on there as to whether it would attenuate noise through to the adjacent residential development.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Any further questions, Commissioner Dimery?
Sorry, I think a lot of them have actually been addressed in your summary. Thank you. I did have some questions about that policy 9 and whether you supported the new wording. Then what else have I got here? You've addressed the vibration. No, thank you. I think that picks up a lot of the questions I had on your original evidence in chief. Thank you.
Yeah, and nothing more from me. Thank you. That's the summary was really useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So moving on, I think we next have Waka Kotahi.
Tēnā kōrua commissioners. I'm Hannah Thompson. I'm a principal planner here at Waka Kotahi, and I've got supporting me today, I've got Graeme Norman. He's our transport expert, and I've also got in the room with me here, in case we have any questions relating to strategy, Tony Horton.
Thank you.
So what we thought we might do is we've read the rebuttal evidence specifically from Mr. Badham and Mr. Ormiston, because those are the ones that pertain mostly to the transport issues that we have with the plan change. So what I thought we'd just do is run through each of the points made in those rebuttal statements. I'm obviously going to be addressing the planning matters, and Graeme will be addressing the transport matters, if that's okay with you.
Do we have anything further from you since your original evidence, or have we got some sort of summary or anything? It's just about we've had a lot of things come through. It's hard to keep
Yes,
on top
so
of the last couple of days.
Graeme and I spoke about that yesterday actually, and if it's okay, we will send through our summaries post-hearing.
Yeah, that would be really
post
helpful.
today.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Yeah, we do
notes.
have it written. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's fine. So
Thank you.
I'll kick off with yeah. So there are a number of transport matters that Mr. Badham raised in his rebuttal evidence. I guess the first one was pertaining to my evidence in chief. Did refer to a number of documents, including Arataki, keeping cities moving, Toitu Te Ao, and also the GPS. Mr. Badham stipulated that he considered these to be internally facing documents. I sort of just wanted to touch on that a little bit. I guess I concur that keeping cities moving and Toitu Te Ao are internally facing. However, these documents are guided by the government policy statement on land transport, which is a central government document required under the Land Transport Management Act. And as you'll be aware, under Section 74 of the RMA, territorial authorities should have regard to management plans and strategies prepared under other acts. So I just consider that the government policy statement and its 4 priorities as elaborated on in my EIC should be a key consideration in the plan change process. The next matter is in relation to accessibility. Mr. Badham maintains that the Plan Change 150 area will have good accessibility for all people due to its location adjacent to a state highway and provision for vehicular, public and active transport. Waka Kotahi does maintain that Plan Change 150 does not offer transport choice, particularly in respect of active and public modes. It is argued that if the residential development is to be realised to its full potential, as supported by Mr. Norman's evidence, there will be a reliance on private vehicle usage to access employment, education and amenities. Whilst Mr. Badham argues that people may be employed in the wider Marsden, Ruakaka industrial commercial areas, there are currently no active mode facilities to support this type of movement, which Waka Kotahi considers will make it less attractive and unsafe for people to undertake these movements. and the applicant has not proposed any measures to facilitate active modes outside the immediate plan change area. Furthermore, Waka Kotahi is concerned that a well-established viable town centre that supports residential growth and supports that in turn supports employment opportunities within the plan change area. We're concerned this won't be achieved despite it being zoned for. We're concerned that residential development may occur without the town centre ever being realised, particularly in light of recent resource consent applications that are currently lodged with council for amenities to be developed outside the plan change area. There is currently one, for example, on the corner of State Highway 1 and 15. Also, Mr. Badham argues that the applicant cannot provide for walking and cycling connectivity beyond its site. There have been many instances across the country in plan changes where walking and cycling facilities have been provided beyond the site, and there's nothing preventing this from occurring. Waka Kotahi considers it an appropriate form of mitigation. So the next point is in relation to Mr. Badham was just seeking clarification as to the relevance of the hierarchy of centres to Waka Kotahi. So the relevance for us, I guess, is that we generally developing land in alignment with strategic documents is of interest to us from a strategic perspective, so that we can align our infrastructure and National Land Transport Fund accordingly. However, notwithstanding this, it's important to note that the commercial and town centre aspects of the development are not highly disputed by Waka Kotahi. The primary issue with the proposal is that it tips the current zoning from predominantly employment-based to residential, which in turn will have significant impacts on the transport network if integrated land use does not occur. The next point is in relation to the relevance of the Ruakaka structure plan. Mr. Badham states that it is over 10 years old and it holds little relevance. So our position is that given the absence of an updated structure plan, we consider the existing Ruakaka structure plan to hold some relevance. Waka Kotahi relies on spatial planning documents to inform future investment on the state highway network. I do, however, note the Whangarei Growth Strategy Sustainable Futures identifies the need to update the Ruakaka structure plan. Waka Kotahi considers this should be undertaken prior to any plan changes occurring. It is also noted that the growth strategy is quite vague as to how development of this area should occur, i.e. whether it's employment, residential, or otherwise, and Waka Kotahi considers a structure plan would help identify what the pattern of development should be. The last point is just in relation to noise, and as you would have heard from Pam earlier, Waka Kotahi does generally seek 100 metres setback from the road corridor. If this can be achieved through providing commercial zone abutting the highway, then we would be supportive of that. There are inherent issues with the noise bund in that it is hard to, I guess, ensure its integrity in the long term and its maintenance through a policy. So that was our primary concern with that. If it does result in the residential zone being in excess of 100 metres from the highway, then we would be supportive of this change.
Thank you. Is that the points you wanted to, all the points you wanted to get through?
Yes, and
Yeah.
Graeme has a number of points to get through as well.
Yeah, I have some questions, but I've got a feeling they're going to be for you both, actually. So I might park mine for now. Commissioner Dimmery, did you have any questions?
Oh, I've frozen.
Yeah, I can't hear you. Actually, I can't hear you, Commissioner Dimery. Oh, your mic's off.
Very sorry, I've got drilling going on downstairs and I muted myself.
Yeah, so I've got called out a
I
couple
was
of times
saying
for dog
just
barking and things yesterday.
if we could hear from Mr. Norman first, I'd just prefer that to tie together the his response. Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Graeme Norman, so a transport consultant, acting on behalf of Wakutahi. I'll just go through, I propose to just sort of go through a summary table that we've developed, which responds to the sort of key points that were raised by Mr. Ormiston in the rebuttal evidence. And I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. So starting with the wider transport effects. So the applicant has relied on PC 150 as representing a self-contained centre. I'm of the view that the proposed changes to MPC will reduce the self-containment of the wider Marsden One Tree Point area. In particular, the provision of 1,200 to 1,600 additional households and more traffic-intensive uses such as commercial and retail will have detrimental effects on the transport network. Removal of industrial land has potential to remove jobs from the wider Marsden One Tree Point area, noting that some will be provided by the commercial and retail. But this overall has the effect of reducing the self-contained nature of the area and could lead to increasing levels of travel further afield, particularly in the peak hour and peak direction. Mr. Ormiston refers to a new scenario in his rebuttal evidence entitled the economically sustainable sort of development level, and he compares that to what is enabled by the MPC provisions. I'm of the opinion that is not a like-for-like comparison because it compares full build out of the existing structure plan against a reduced development scenario under the proposed provisions. With regard to the assessment of the 500 dwelling threshold, Mr. Ormiston's confirmed the trip rates used. He's done an extra sensitivity test around travel distribution. Given all of those clarifications, I'm comfortable with the assessment that's been undertaken to inform that 500 dwelling threshold. With regard to the assessment of the full build out scenario, so and the economically sustainable scenario for that matter. In my original evidence, I raised a number of points around internal trip rates used, cross visitation, travel distribution, trip rates used. Mr. Ormiston's clarified a number of those assumptions in relation to the 500 dwelling modelling. However, the assessment on the longer term scenario still appears to use the assumptions set out in the ITA. My concerns on those matters remain as set out in my evidence. With regards to trip rates, the rebuttal evidence includes some updated assumptions related to the economically sustainable scenario. From what I understand, that scenario has not fed into the traffic modelling assessments that have been undertaken. Although I do note the level of development proposed in that economically sustainable scenario is less than the 100% development scenario. But I remain to have concerns over some of the assumptions made in that assessment. With regards to background traffic, Mr. Ormiston's rebuttal addresses the change in background traffic across the different time periods. I'm of the view that the short-term modelling the background traffic change is insignificant, and I'm happy with Mr. Ormiston's response that that doesn't really change the assessment. In the long term, the background traffic change is more significant, and I'm concerned that the longer term tests don't use the most up-to-date information in that regard. From a walking and cycling perspective, within the rebuttal, Mr. Ormiston does not consider walking and cycling connections outside the PC 150 area to be the responsibility of the applicant. In my opinion, PC 150 will generate walking and cycling demand to the neighbouring areas. If no appropriate routes are provided or facilities are provided, this will either create safety issues or result in less people walking and cycling. With regard to provisions, so just a couple of points there. If the commissioners were of the mind to approve the plan change, I still consider the State Highway 15 and State Highway 1 roundabout as a relevant consideration for future ITAs. The roundabout will cater for a large portion of the development traffic and will be a practical constraint when considering the longer term build out of the site. I consider this issue particularly relevant given the recent changes to upgrade projects on the State Highway 1 corridor under the New Zealand Up program. Mr. Ormiston states that development traffic will only constitute 5% of daily traffic on State Highway 1. I note that the 5% seems to correspond to the economically sustainable scenario, not the full build out as enabled by PC 150. Based on the proposed activities, I suspect peak direction travel will have a far greater proportion of traffic flows on State Highway 1 than the stated 5%. And given the current conditions and lack of certainty around future upgrades, this has potential for effects to safety and congestion on that strategically important route. While I note that the provisions require future ITAs to be undertaken once the initial development trigger is reached, so after 500 dwellings, I'm concerned that the longer term effects have not been adequately assessed, in particular the effects on the State Highway 15 and State Highway 1 intersection. In my opinion, a plan change will set expectations for the proposed land use, and I have concerns that future ITAs will not have enough power to stop development if the wider transport projects are not provided. So those are all the points I wanted to go through. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. And you can also provide us with a copy of those notes.
Yep, sure.
Great, thank you. That'd be really helpful. Commissioner Dimmery, did you have any questions?
Thank you. It's quite a lot to take in there. So starting, Ms. Thompson, with the strategic context, I understand what you are recommending to us is to take into account the government policy statement and wider strategic context there. I do wonder, we've got a lot of documents as the recently confirmed, you've mentioned it, growth strategy and from September. So things keep moving, and to what extent is it a little bit chicken and egg that we have quite long-term documents that are planned out looking to 20, 30 years ahead, and in the meantime we also have, I heard from Ms. Shaw yesterday, an update on the appeal settlements from the urban and services plan changes, and so it does seem that these documents do all move on and get a little bit out of sync. So from what I understood yesterday is that there is a large degree of urban development to the north at One Tree Point that's been agreed through settlement, and has this been taken into account in Waka Kotahi's planning, particularly for, you've mentioned needing to take into account strategy to inform funding. So do you also take into account the settlement of recent appeals and the district plan in addition to these strategic documents?
Kia ora
So my
koutou.
question is the fund?
Yep.
Sorry.
So I can
So
probably.
is the funding taking into account, just
Yep.
to summarise it, because it was long-winded yet again, is it taking into account also the settlement of urban plan change appeals, and is that taken into account in your funding and planning for the state highway network?
So yeah, kia ora koutou, Tony Horton from Waka Kotahi. So I'll probably answer that question in two parts. So I think the first comment was around, you know, that plans and strategies move on, and I think that's always a risk with strategies. As soon as they're written, they they can often become outdated. My one observation at the moment would be that the outcomes that the GPS is seeking, particularly around better transport options, emissions reduction and safety, is very much aligned with what the Whangarei District Growth Strategy is talking about in terms of transport outcomes. And particularly when we look at better transport options, accessibility and reducing vehicle kilometre travelled, there's also very strong alignment with the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, particularly Objective 3 and Policy 1. So I think at the moment we've actually got quite a robust strategic framework in which to consider plan changes such as this when we look at mobility issues and the importance of urban form. To answer your second question, so Waka Kotahi basically reviews its National Land Transport Fund every 3 years, and that's informed by work that Waka Kotahi do in terms of its state highway network, but it's also informed by work that the regional and territorial councils do through their RLTPs. Now, the RLTPs should be taking into account changes in land use patterns. So, for example, new zoning that's brought into play, but obviously the funding also needs to consider those GPS outcomes. So they've got to be delivering in terms of better transport choice, modal shift, and increasingly looking at emissions reduction and reduction in vehicle trip kilometres. So hopefully that's answered your question.
So is it fair to say that as development gets built out, the Waka Kotahi does respond through improving public transport, walking and cycling infrastructure? In other words, you do respond to growth rather than expecting the infrastructure to be in place first and all complete before the growth happens?
So in terms of public transport and active modes, public transport is managed by the regional council, so it's not something that we directly fund, but we do subsidise. And similarly with active modes, generally that's the district council that delivers those projects, and where appropriate we subsidise. In terms of whether we would expect infrastructure to be in place before or after, from a strategic point of view, and looking at our strategic framework, Arataki and keeping cities moving, we would expect alignment. So this is the key of land use and transport integration. So the two should come at the same time. And I think looking at other development that we're involved in, particularly in Auckland, there's certainly a lot of work done in terms of staging and sequencing, so that when land is released and when development occurs, the right infrastructure is in place to support a well-functioning urban environment day one.
Do you have any examples in the Whangarei district? Because I am aware there has been quite a bit of greenfield development in parts of Whangarei, and has Waka Kotahi been involved in providing funding for anything more local? and was that in place before it happened? I'm just wondering in the local context if there's any other examples.
Look, can certainly go back and have a look at what funding we've got in the current NLTP. What I would say is we do work quite closely with all 3 district councils in terms of their spatial planning processes to ensure that there is alignment and a forward view of what's needed. So an example of that would be the Kaipara sub-regional plans. In Far North District, we're working with them on the Kerikeri Waipapa spatial plan, and in Whangarei we've been working with council on their placemaking plans for Tikipunga and Hikurangi, and that placemaking program is also earmarked to review of the Ruakaka structure plan in 2023. So we find that the most useful mechanism to create this alignment, this land use transport integration, rather than necessarily waiting for a regulatory process such as a plan change.
So based on what you're telling us, you don't consider it to be aligned at the moment. So what relief are you seeking that we recommend this plan change is not adopted? Or something different?
Yeah, look, so I think from my perspective, and I think Hannah would probably want to comment on this as well. Obviously, we acknowledge what's currently in the operative plan provisions. I think the concern is the change that's happened, and I guess from my perspective, and again from a strategic planning perspective, it's looking at how the development is staged and sequenced in terms of those, particularly those public transport services. And secondly, looking at those active mode connections, which Hannah discussed in her summary as well.
And I think just thirdly, to add to that, ensuring that those employment opportunities are available as well within the plan change area. That would be the third point to make.
So we heard from Mr. Heath yesterday that he gave an update that growth in the larger catchment is proceeding much quicker than forecast previously, and they're waiting for the update on the SA for this area. And he did comment that there was already well in excess of, I think it was something like 450 hectares of industrial land in the immediate vicinity. So I'm not sure to what extent it's zoned, but are you suggesting that it shouldn't be able to be built until the employment comes? I'm just trying to understand what realistic provision could be put in this plan change to achieve the outcome you're seeking. So you're suggesting that it's important to have employment there. How could this be addressed through the provisions?
Yeah, good question. I guess obviously, like, the key for us here is that we're trying to reduce the private vehicle usage. So I don't have an answer for you, sorry, Rachel, but yeah, I guess like our key concern here is that the plan change is going to develop its residential land, and that employment isn't going to occur within the plan change area. Our preference, I guess, when we're working alongside councils now is, developing land that is close to employment opportunities, and that's the fundamental issue for us here, is that we know that many people will be making trips into Whangarei for employment. I know that there is land zoned for industrial in the wider area, but then there's the concern, I guess, for us that this land now here was zoned industrial and there wasn't the uptake. So we still just don't have that certainty that the employment's going to occur, so.
So just sorry to labour the point, but taking a step back is there any public transport in Ruakaka at present or servicing this area?
There's
Can
one
anyone
bus,
tell
isn't
me?
there? I think that there is currently one bus service, but it's more aimed at elderly, I understand, making trips into town for shopping.
So it's a once a week service run by the Northland Regional Council. I think runs on a Thursday. Excuse me. I would note that the Regional Council is in the process of finalising their regional public transport plan, but from what Waka Kotahi understands, there's no immediate plans from the council to either increase the frequency of that service or the number of stops in the area that it covers.
So do you think this is this sort of states the problem quite clearly? There's a lot of development that's already happened at One Tree Point and the existing Ruakaka town centre. And so to what extent is it reasonable to, do you build it and the public transport will come, or do you require that to be in place? Just going back to Mr. Horton's comments about preferring the sequencing and timing for it to go hand in hand. Is that realistic, given the amount of urban development out there already? And from what I saw on our site visit, I don't think there's any provision for cycle infrastructure at present, and you've confirmed the public transport infrastructure. I do realise it's a question of funding, but to what extent is it realistic to expect this to happen before or at the same time as development in a large catchment like this?
And could I come in with a sort of supplementary question that sort of links to that? I think is the fact that we may, the structure plan is going to be reviewed. The structure plan could well, identify a network of cycle routes across the wider area, for instance, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be funding for them, does it? So, what is important, it is very chicken and egg, isn't it? In getting development there is more likely to, I guess, encourage funding for these upgrades.
So Richard, that's a very good observation. I guess strategically, from my point of view, I'd probably make two comments. So firstly, picking up that a spatial plan or that kind of master planning is really essential in terms of identifying what and where those opportunities exist, and also aligning that with the timing of growth. So that's why strategically our preference is for those, those spatial planning exercises to be undertaken prior to a plan change. Coming to the second point around chicken and egg, it is a difficult one. I think what we're seeing more and more, though, is that for us to, particularly in terms of the MPS and well-functioning environments, there needs to be alignment with PT services and development. That's not necessarily to say that a full PT service has got to be in place before the first house is constructed, but there needs to be a relationship between the two, and part of that is a funding question in terms of I guess NRC's role with the public transport service, but the second part of it is how land is released, and particularly how residential land is sequenced, so that when people do move in to a new community such as this, that they do have a broad range of travel options available to them.
I guess the question for me in relation to that, though, we have a plan change before us, and is there anything the plan, if we were to accept the plan change, obviously with there's various amendments proposed, but if we were to recommend that the council accept the plan change, it's not closing the door on any of these things, is it? Sorry, that I should have phrase that as a question rather than a statement. Is it closing the door on any of these things?
No, I mean, you're right in terms of it certainly doesn't prevent any opportunities to be put forward in terms of PT and active modes, but I guess again strategically there's a question around the certainty of that happening. Looking that alongside the number of people that could potentially be moving and living in this community, and when ultimately does that meet the requirements under the national policy statement, particularly that policy 1.
Sorry, Rachel, I hijacked your question. Did you have any further? Did you have further questions?
I did have more specific questions. So moving down to Mr. Norman's comments about the provisions recommended by Mr. Ormiston. So what I understood from Mr. Ormiston was that as a result of the settlement of the appeals on the TRA chapter, there's a much better ability to more frequently assess transport network requirements, and that is the reason a bunch of the provisions have been deleted, and they're proposing reliance on those new TRA provisions, with the, I suppose, the belts and braces of this, the addition of this 500 trip rate trigger as well.
Yep.
So what I understood from Mr. Ormiston, that no one's saying that there won't be network improvements required, but there are going to be more frequent opportunities to assess those requirements as development progresses, because it could be quite patchy, or it could happen in a large tranche. So am I understanding you, Mr. Norman, to be saying that are you or are you not happy with relying on that TRA rule and the 500 trip rate rule that's been amended, if it wasn't clear?
Yep. I think from my perspective, I'm happy with those provisions, with the exception of the sort of extents that are looked at, and including that State Highway 1 15 roundabout, because of that sort of wider issue that we have strategically, that wider effects of this main change.
So looking at, I think it's the MCP information requirement X, it's on page 15 of the precinct. It does mention levels of service and intersections. Would a way to be addressing your concern to be to add the roundabout into this? Are there any amendments you could recommend to us?
Yeah, I mean, just adding the roundabout, an assessment of the roundabout would, in my mind, go a long way to that, to having that concern.
And I just wanted to better understand your comments that you agree that Mr. Ormiston's he's reviewed the assumptions, and so that's fine for the shorter term, but it's the longer term you're concerned about. And so does this tie in with the roundabout issue as well? Are the two related?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So one way to address it might be to suggest some wording to amend these provisions that perhaps Ms. Thompson could assist, and yourself could make a suggestion there for us.
Yeah, I mean, the one other point that I raised was, I suppose, just setting expectations from approval of the plan change, that this land can be developed given the wider constraints. So whether I think adding a provision around the roundabout operation would go a long way to sort of alleviate that concern.
is there anything else that you think is missing or could be added that for assessments? Or is that the key one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key one from my perspective.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps, Mr. Chair, do you have any other questions? I'll just check my notes on the evidence and check I haven't missed anything.
Yeah, so mine relates to a sort of a issues internal to the development, because I think clearly, I think you're expressing concern regarding how sort of self-sustaining or self-supporting the development is in terms of the appropriate levels of commercial, residential, and the town centre coming forward there. I suppose one of the issues in relation to how well it functions and how well those various elements function together relates to the internal movement within the development. And I don't know whether you heard yesterday, there was some discussion regarding the rules regarding the provision of new roads and indicative roads, and likewise discussion regarding any rules requiring the alterations that are shown within the plan change to existing roads, and that all links, as far as I see it, in terms of providing a more connected street network within the development, but also changes which I think to the existing roads would improve the environment for pedestrians and cyclists and whatever, rather than sharing a large carriageway with vehicles. Were you or which of you were there listening yesterday? Any of you, or did any of you hear that? No. So the rules are there in terms of allowing those changes and those things as a permitted activity if they're in line with the plan, but there's nothing in place, as I heard it yesterday, that requires those roads go in those new locations, or nothing requiring that the existing roads have to be updated, upgraded or downgraded, whichever way you see it. Did you have any thoughts and comments regarding that? And how perhaps it could be achieved in terms of insisting upon those, or your concerns if it wasn't to happen? Perhaps Mr. Norman, or yeah, fine.
Yeah, I mean, typically within plan changes, you'd have an indicative road network with some standards around what particular upgrades you need on what road. And then there's normally checks and balances as you go through the consenting process, whether those are implemented at the various times. I'm not, maybe leave it to Ms. Thompson to comment on what planning provisions would be appropriate.
Well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, is I suppose from a transport perspective, and that's for Mr. Norman, how critical do you see them being, both the new roads that are shown and the changes to the existing roads? That's the first question, I guess. And then after you've answered that, Ms. Thompson, are the methods you see that could be utilised to insist that those things happen and are implemented?
Yep. So I think, upgrading the footpaths and cycleways and whatnot, speed calming the areas would be really important, especially given the assumptions that have been made through the assessment. So having those sort of local trips to the centre and the town centre and retail from the residential. So I think it needs some mechanism to ensure that those upgrades happen.
Thank you. And Ms. Thompson.
I don't have anything too much further to add. Obviously, these roads are going to be local roads, and so they're going to be managed by the council.
Yeah.
But I would just agree with Graeme that, you know, we want to be facilitating those active modes as much as possible, and so you know, provision needs to be made for that to occur, and for that to be a minimum, like that needs to be required, that you know, pedestrian and cycling movements are provided for adequately.
Thank you. Commissioner Dimmery, did you have any more?
One thing we've suffered from in this consideration of rules and effects is not having dimensions or understanding. So, Ms. Thompson, you've talked about in terms of the noise, having not having noise sensitive activities within 100 metres of the highway. I'm presuming, but don't know, that now that the commercial zone's proposed next to the state highway, I'm unsure whether there's any residential or noise sensitive activities left within 100 metres, but because we don't have dimensions.
Yes, exactly. And that's why
I don't know if that's something you've checked.
Yeah, and so I wasn't
sure.
Have you checked that? Yeah, that's the one thing I wasn't sure of. So I wasn't sure whether that residential did encroach on that 100 metres. That's why I sort of just briefly mentioned earlier, Commissioner Dimmery, that we do generally require a 100 metre setback. I'm unsure whether the residential zone encroaches on that. If it does, then we would, I guess, still be supportive of the noise bund, but keeping in mind that we are concerned about the ongoing maintenance and integrity of that, because I'm not sure how you put into policy who looks after it if it's compromised.
Yes, I had a number of questions on that, but as I understand it, the applicant's no longer proposing it. So, yeah, there are issues with it.
Mm.
I think trustfully will hear back about 100 metres. So, to confirm, if it turned out that some of sub precinct, I can't remember which one it is, D, was within 100 metres, you would be seeking some provision to address potential noise sensitive activities and that.
Or the dwelling on the site would just have to be set back enough to be outside that 100 metres. So if the site fell within the 100 metres, if you could set the dwelling back far enough, then that would be adequate as well.
Okay.
Or not the dwelling, sorry, just the noise sensitive activity, whatever that may be.
Thank you. I think that's covered everything. Thank you. Good. Thank you, everyone. It's all from me.
Nothing more from me either. So thank you to the three of you. That's been really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for your time, commissioners.
That's good. No, thank you. We're running a bit later, which is fine, than we'd expected. So we were due to look at morning tea at 10:20. It's now 10:30. We haven't heard from Mr. Hartley. So I think I saw Mr. Hartley's name pop up to say that he was here. Mr. Hartley, are you here? And are you okay for time if we take our 15-minute break now?
A coffee now would be fine.
Yeah, good.
Yes.
Let's do that.
Thank you.
Before we head off on a break, though, Mr. Allen, I'm just conscious that I would really like to get through everything today. Had you had any thoughts about your reply and how you wish to do that?
So I think there's obviously a plan that we're going to give you with some dimensions that more, I guess, clearly show what Mr. Ibbotson described to you yesterday in terms of those dimensions up by the railway and the key 100-metre distances and where things are set back.
Yeah.
I'm not sure from memory if there's much more physically that we need to give you at this point. I'm happy to do an oral reply, but it may be that you want something in note form as well. That's sort of your call in a sense.
Yeah.
At one level, there's nothing I've heard so far that requires me to do a lot more in terms of that I haven't already addressed in some way in opening, and that I could come back and just take you to those particular points. But I appreciate sometimes decision makers quite like a written reply, because when you come around to writing everything, you might have forgotten what I said, and it's the end of the day, and it's all a bit kind of challenging to recall it all.
We would definitely like whatever you do in writing, as well as whether you wish to speak with us or whether you just wanted to rely upon having it in writing.
I'd like to have a discussion. I'd like to do an oral reply if I could.
Yeah.
Let's hope we can do that this afternoon. I've got some notes I'm doing here, and there are a number of submitters yet to come, but we do have some degree of sense of what they're likely to say. So.
Yeah.
But I suspect by the time we've finished all this, we might have some other bits and pieces we need to come back to you on specifically anyway, in addition.
Yeah. Well, we're keeping touch as we go through the day and see how things are tracking. Good. Okay, so it's just gone 10:30, but we come back at 10:45, so we're adjourned till 10:45. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.